There's a moment when you realize that every conversation you've ever had has been a negotiation for your soul. They probe, they poke, they analyze your reactions like scientists dissecting a specimen. They watch how you respond to praise, how you react to criticism, how you handle pressure. They're building a blueprint of your psychology, mapping the coordinates of your breaking points. And once they have that map, you belong to them. But what if you became unmappable? The ancients understood something we've forgotten in our age of social media transparency and corporate team-building exercises. They knew that mystery was the most potent form of protection, that unpredictability was the ultimate armor. When Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be feared than loved, he was touching on something deeper than mere intimidation. He was speaking about the power of the incomprehensible. Consider the chess master who never reveals their thinking. Their opponents spend countless hours trying to decode their patterns, searching for the algorithm that governs their moves. But the master has transcended pattern. They have achieved something beyond strategy. They have become strategically chaotic, deliberately unreadable. Their power doesn't come from superior moves. It comes from the opponent's inability to predict what those moves will be. This is not about becoming erratic or inconsistent. Chaos without purpose is just noise. What we're discussing is calculated inscrutability, disciplined unpredictability. It's the difference between a broken machine and a quantum engine. One is malfunction. The other is operating on principles too sophisticated for conventional understanding. Watch how people react when they encounter someone they cannot categorize. There's an immediate shift in their posture, a subtle recalibration of their approach. The confident become cautious. The aggressive become respectful. The manipulative become honest. Because manipulation requires a degree of predictability to function. Here's your first practical lesson. Someone at work tries to corner you with a loaded question in front of others. So, what's your real opinion about the new policy changes? The conventional response is either enthusiastic support or careful diplomatic neutrality. Both responses give them data. Both responses make you readable. Instead, you pause for exactly 3 seconds, maintain eye contact, and say, "That's an interesting way to frame the question." Then you turn to someone else and ask about their weekend plans. You've just demonstrated that you operate by rules they don't understand, and that uncertainty creates a protective barrier around you. The psychological impact is immediate and profound. They expected a direct answer to a direct question. They received something that suggested layers of consideration they hadn't anticipated. You've indicated that your mind processes information differently than theirs, and different equals dangerous in the primitive calculus of social dynamics. But let's go deeper than workplace tactics. Let's examine the philosophical foundation of this power. Human beings are pattern recognition machines. We survived as a species because we could predict where the predator would strike, when the seasons would change, how our tribe members would react to various stimuli. This same instinct drives modern social interaction. We feel safe when we can predict behavior, and we feel threatened when we cannot. The moment you become unpredictable, you tap into something primal in the observer's brain. You become what evolutionary psychologists call a cognitive anomaly, something that doesn't fit existing mental models. And cognitive anomalies demand respect, because the brain cannot afford to dismiss what it cannot understand. Here's where it becomes genuinely dangerous for your opponents. They begin to project competence and wisdom onto your silence. They assume that your mysterious responses indicate deep thinking, superior knowledge, or hidden agendas. You haven't claimed to be brilliant. You've simply refused to be easily categorized, and their minds have filled in the blanks with their own insecurities and assumptions. Machiavelli observed that the lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. But what if you were neither lion nor fox? What if you were something unprecedented, something that existed outside their taxonomies of power and weakness? Let me give you a specific scenario that illustrates this principle in action. You're at a social gathering, and someone attempts to publicly challenge your credibility. I heard you've been struggling with your business lately. Is it true that you're having financial problems? This is a social assassination attempt designed to diminish your status in front of the group. The predictable responses are denial, deflection, or counterattack. All of these reactions confirm that you're playing by their rules. Instead, you let the silence extend for a full 5 seconds. Then you smile slightly and say, "I've always found that people who ask that kind of question in public are usually projecting their own anxieties. But I appreciate your concern." Then you take a sip of your drink and wait. You've just performed something approaching social alchemy. You've transformed their attack into evidence of their weakness. You've suggested that you understand psychological dynamics they don't even recognize. You've indicated that you're operating from a position of knowledge and calm that makes their aggression look primitive and desperate. But the real power move comes next. Instead of following up with more psychological analysis or returning to normal conversation, you maintain that slight smile and ask them, "How's your relationship with your father?" The question is completely unrelated to their attack, but it suggests that you've just psychoanalyzed them in those 5 seconds of silence and identified their core wound. Whether you're right or wrong becomes irrelevant. They'll spend the next week wondering what you saw that they don't even see about themselves. This is what happens when unpredictability becomes a weapon. You're not just defending against their attack, you're demonstrating that you operate in dimensions they haven't even discovered yet. Now, let's examine the deeper mechanisms at work. When you consistently refuse to be easily read, people begin to attribute to you a quality that psychologists call cognitive complexity. They assume you're thinking about things they're not thinking about, considering variables they haven't identified, operating from information they don't possess. This assumption becomes self-reinforcing. The more mysterious you appear, the more intelligent they assume you to be. The more intelligent they assume you to be, the more carefully they interact with you. The more carefully they interact with you, the more power you accumulate in the relationship. Here's a digital age example. Someone leaves a provocative comment on your social media post, clearly trying to bait you into an argument that will make you look bad to your followers. They write, "Interesting perspective, but don't you think you're oversimplifying the issue? I'd love to hear how you address the obvious counter-arguments." The conventional response is either to engage with their challenge directly or to ignore it completely. Both strategies are readable. Instead, you respond with exactly 7 words. That's one way to look at it. Nothing more. No elaboration, no defense, no counterattack. This response is psychologically devastating because it suggests you've considered their point, found it wanting, but don't consider it worth explaining why. You've indicated that the gap between your understanding and theirs is so vast that bridging it would require more effort than they deserve. You've positioned yourself as someone who operates from a level of knowledge that makes their challenge appear naive. The person who posted the challenge is now in an impossible position. They can't escalate without looking desperate. They can't claim victory because you haven't conceded anything. They're left wondering what you know that they don't, what perspective you're operating from that makes their obvious counter-arguments seem irrelevant to you. But we're still operating in the shallows. Let's go deeper into the philosophy of strategic inscrutability. The ancient Taoists understood that the most powerful position is wu wei, action through non-action, influence through non-interference. When you become unreadable, you force others to project their own interpretations onto your behavior. And since people always project from their own psychological framework, they inevitably reveal more about themselves than they learn about you. Every attempt to decode you becomes an unwitting confession of their own mental architecture. When they say, "I think you're being manipulative," they're really saying, "If I were in your position, I would be manipulating." When they say, "You're probably planning something," they're revealing that planning and scheming is how their own minds work. This dynamic creates what intelligence analysts call psychological leverage. You gain information about their decision-making processes, their fears, their assumptions, their blind spots, all while revealing nothing meaningful about your own. It's the ultimate information asymmetry, and information asymmetry is the foundation of all strategic advantage. Here's how this plays out in romantic relationships, where the stakes are simultaneously higher and more subtle. Your partner tries to trap you with the classic, "Do you think she's prettier than me?" This question is a psychological minefield designed to extract information about your desires, your loyalties, your capacity for deception. The readable responses are reassurance, deflection, or honesty. All of these give your partner data about how you handle pressure, what you value, how you prioritize truth versus harmony. Instead, you pause, look at them with genuine curiosity and ask, "What would it mean to you if I said yes?" Then you wait for their answer. You've just transformed a test of your character into an exploration of their psychology. You've indicated that you understand the question behind the question, that you're more interested in the emotional architecture that generated their inquiry than in providing the simple answer they expected. You've suggested that you operate from a level of psychological sophistication that makes their original question seem almost quaint. This response forces them to examine their own motivations. Why did they ask? What were they hoping to discover? What insecurity or concern drove the question? You've shifted the dynamic from you being evaluated to them being understood. And understanding always carries more power than being understood. Machiavelli wrote that since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. But he was wrong about one crucial element. There's something more powerful than either love or fear, and that's bewilderment. Bewilderment contains elements of both, the respect that comes from fear and the fascination that comes from attraction, but without the weaknesses inherent in either. When someone cannot predict your responses, they cannot manipulate your psychology. Manipulation requires knowing which buttons to push, and you've made your buttons invisible. You've created what military strategists call defensive ambiguity. The enemy cannot target what they cannot accurately identify. But here's where the strategy becomes truly sophisticated. You're not just defending against manipulation, you're actively gathering intelligence about everyone who attempts to read you. Each failed attempt to decode your psychology gives you information about their methods, their assumptions, their own psychological vulnerabilities. Someone at a professional networking event tries to establish dominance through the classic power handshake, grabbing your hand and pulling you slightly off balance while maintaining aggressive eye contact. This is a primitive attempt to establish physical and psychological superiority. The conventional responses are either to submit to their dominance or to escalate the physical contest. Instead, you allow the aggressive handshake to happen, but you maintain perfect relaxation in your body and a slight smile on your face. You don't resist their pull, but you don't yield to it either. You exist in a state of relaxed alertness that suggests their attempted dominance display is merely amusing to you. Then, while they're still gripping your hand, you place your other hand gently on their shoulder and say, "I appreciate the enthusiasm." You've just demonstrated that you recognize their power play for what it is, that you're not intimidated by it, and that you understand psychological dynamics they're probably not even conscious of. You've positioned their aggression as enthusiasm, which is simultaneously patronizing and kind. You've shown that you can remain calm and centered regardless of their attempts to destabilize you. The person attempting the power play is now in psychological free fall. They expected either submission or escalation. They received something that suggested you operate from a completely different understanding of power itself. They're left wondering what kind of training or experience or natural ability allows someone to remain so unaffected by what they intended as a dominance display. This is the essence of strategic unpredictability. You don't just refuse to play by their rules. You demonstrate that you're playing an entirely different game, one whose rules they don't even recognize. Now we arrive at the most dangerous territory, existential unpredictability. This is where you transcend tactical responses and begin operating from a fundamentally different relationship to reality itself. Most people live in a constant state of psychological defensiveness. They're perpetually explaining themselves, justifying their choices, seeking approval, avoiding criticism. This defensive stance makes them infinitely readable because their responses are determined by their needs for validation and security. But what if you developed a relationship to criticism, praise, success, and failure that existed outside conventional frameworks entirely? What if approval and disapproval became equally irrelevant to your sense of self? What if you achieved what the Stoics called philosophical immunity, the capacity to remain psychologically unchanged regardless of external circumstances? Someone launches a coordinated attack on your reputation, spreading rumors, attempting to damage your professional standing. They expect you to defend yourself, to counter their narrative, to engage in the public relations battle they've initiated. Instead, you do nothing. You continue your work, maintain your relationships, pursue your goals, as if their attack simply doesn't exist in your reality. This non-response is more psychologically devastating than any counterattack could be. It suggests that their entire campaign against you is so far beneath your notice that it doesn't warrant acknowledgement. It indicates that you operate from a level of security and self-possession that makes their attempts at damage seem like children throwing stones at a mountain. The people observing this dynamic begin to question their own assumptions about reputation, defense, and response. If someone can remain completely unaffected by what appears to be a serious attack on their character, what do they know about power and self-worth that the observers don't understand? Machiavelli observed that hatred is acquired just as much by good works as by evil ones. He understood that conspicuous virtue can be as threatening to some people as conspicuous vice. But he didn't explore the logical extension of this insight, that true invulnerability comes not from being good or evil, but from being incomprehensible. When your responses transcend conventional categories of appropriate and inappropriate, strong and weak, clever and foolish, you achieve something approaching social immortality. You cannot be destroyed by tactics that depend on predictable human psychology because you've transcended predictable human psychology. Here's a final example that illustrates the ultimate expression of this principle. You're in a situation where multiple people are trying to pressure you into a decision that serves their interests, but not yours. They're using every psychological lever they can identify: guilt, obligation, fear, social pressure, logical argument, emotional manipulation. The conventional response is to resist each pressure point individually, to defend against each argument, to explain why you can't or won't comply with their demands. This approach makes you predictable because it reveals what kinds of pressure work on you and what kinds don't. Instead, you listen to their entire presentation in complete silence. You maintain relaxed attention, as if you're genuinely interested in understanding their perspective. When they finish, you pause for 10 seconds, then say, "I can see this is important to you." Another pause. "I'll need to think about it." Then you stand up and leave. You've just refused to engage with their pressure tactics entirely. You haven't said yes or no. You haven't explained your reasoning or defended your position. You've acknowledged their investment in the outcome without indicating whether that investment has any influence on your decision-making process. This response is profoundly disorienting because it operates outside the normal frameworks of negotiation and influence. They can't tell whether you're considering their request seriously or dismissing it entirely. They can't determine whether your politeness indicates willingness to comply or sophisticated rejection. They're left completely uncertain about your psychology, your priorities, and your decision-making process. And uncertainty about your psychology becomes respect for your power. The weeks that follow their request become a masterclass in psychological dynamics. They'll analyze every interaction with you for clues about your thinking. They'll modify their behavior toward you based on assumptions about what might influence your final decision. They'll treat you with the careful consideration reserved for people whose responses cannot be predicted or controlled. You've achieved something that transcends normal social dynamics entirely. You've made your psychology into a black box that influences everyone around you while remaining immune to their influence. You've become what military strategists call a force multiplier. Your mere presence changes the calculations of everyone in your environment. This is not about manipulation or deception. This is about transcending the predictable patterns that make manipulation possible in the first place. When people cannot read your psychology, they cannot target your vulnerabilities, cannot push your buttons, cannot anticipate your responses, cannot plan strategies that depend on specific reactions from you, you become what the ancient Chinese strategists called like water, taking the shape of any container while remaining fundamentally unchanged, flowing around obstacles without being stopped by them, appearing soft while wearing away the hardest stone through patient persistence. The philosopher Lao Tzu understood this when he wrote that the sage does not attempt anything very big and thus achieves greatness. The power we're discussing doesn't require grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It manifests through the simple refusal to be psychologically predictable, the disciplined rejection of conventional response patterns, the cultivation of what we might call strategic mystery. And here's the beautiful paradox. The less you need people to understand you, the more they desperately want to. The less you seek their approval, the more valuable that approval becomes. The less you fear their rejection, the less likely they are to reject you. You achieve influence by refusing to pursue it, gain respect by not demanding it, accumulate power by not grasping for it. But this path requires a kind of discipline that most people will never develop. It requires the capacity to remain psychologically centered when everyone around you is trying to destabilize you. It requires the wisdom to recognize manipulation attempts without becoming defensive about them. It requires the strength to maintain your mystery even when revelation would be more convenient or socially expected. Most importantly, it requires you to develop a relationship with yourself that doesn't depend on external validation or understanding. You must become so secure in your own psychological architecture that other people's inability to map it becomes irrelevant to your sense of self-worth. When you achieve this level of internal coherence, something remarkable happens. You stop needing to be understood, and that liberation from the need for understanding becomes the foundation of a power that cannot be threatened or diminished. You become unassailable, not because you're stronger than your opponents, but because you exist outside the frameworks they use to determine strength and weakness. This is the ultimate evolution of strategic thinking. You transcend the need to win or lose, to dominate or submit, to attack or defend. You exist in a space beyond conventional power dynamics, operating from principles that transform every interaction into an opportunity to demonstrate the futility of trying to control what cannot be comprehended. And in that incomprehensibility, you find something approaching true freedom, Because when no one can predict your responses, no one can constrain your choices. When no one can map your psychology, no one can manipulate your decisions. When no one can read your intentions, no one can prepare counters to your strategies. You become uncontrollable not through rebellion or resistance, but through the simple elegance of being unreadable. And what cannot be read cannot be controlled. What cannot be predicted cannot be defeated. What cannot be understood cannot be destroyed. This is not theory, this is not philosophy. This is the practical reality of psychological sovereignty, available to anyone willing to develop the discipline required to achieve it. Power doesn't explain itself. Power doesn't justify its decisions. Power doesn't seek understanding or approval. Power simply is. And when you become unpredictable, you become untouchable.